The wind howled like 1,000 dying spirits, tearing at the reinforced shutters of the sanctuary cabin. Inside, the thermometer on the wall had dropped to a terrifying 40 degrees below zero. This wasn't just a winter storm, it was the White Death, a blizzard so ferocious it buried history under ice. But for Elara, known to the locals and the pack alike as Mama Wolf, and for the rust-colored fluffball pacing anxiously at her feet, there was no choice. The Ghost Pack, a family of 7 strays trapped in the Deadwood Valley, wouldn't survive another 6 hours without food. The decision to go out there was madness, perhaps a suicide mission, but looking into the amber eyes of Ginger, the pup who had once been left for dead in a similar storm, Elara knew they had to move. Before we dive into this freezing abyss where every second counts, if these bonds of survival and love warm your heart, and you want to hear more stories of courage like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, and leave a comment. Turn on notifications so you'll be the first to know about new stories. Elara tightened the straps of her heavy parka, her fingers trembling slightly not from cold, but from adrenaline. She looked down at Ginger. The pup was barely 6 months old, a genetic anomaly with fur the color of burnt autumn leaves, distinguishing him from the grays and blacks of his kin. He wasn't just a pet. He was a survivor, a bridge between the human world and the wild shadows of the forest. He sensed the urgency. He whined, a high-pitched sound that cut through the roaring wind outside, and nudged the heavy canvas saddlebags resting on the floor. They were filled with raw venison, suet blocks, and nutrient-dense kibble. Christmas dinner for ghosts. "I know, Gingy," Elara whispered, kneeling to look him in the eye. "It's going to be rough, maybe the roughest it's ever been. You ready to be Santa Claus for your cousins?" Ginger barked, a sharp, confident sound that defied his size. He didn't understand the concept of Santa Claus, of course, but he understood the mission. He understood that the red harness Elara was buckling onto him meant work. It meant purpose. And for a wolf, purpose was everything. Elara clipped a small, blinking safety light to the harness, casting a rhythmic red glow against his ginger fur. It looked festive, almost cheerful, a stark contrast to the lethal gray void waiting outside the door. She grabbed her walking poles and the heavy sled rope. "Okay, let's bring them some joy." As Elara pushed the heavy oak door open, the wind hit them like a physical blow, a solid wall of ice that stole the breath from her lungs. The world had been erased. There was no sky, no ground, only a swirling vortex of white. Ginger didn't flinch. He lowered his head, his ears pinned back against his skull, and drove forward, breaking the trail. The snow was already waist-deep in the drifts. The first mile was a battle for every inch. The sanctuary sat on a ridge, and the path to Deadwood Valley required navigating a treacherous descent through dense pines. The trees, usually towering sentinels, were bent double under the weight of the snow, groaning and cracking like pistol shots in the dark. Elara's goggles were icing over every few minutes, forcing her to stop and scrape them clear. Every time she paused, Ginger would circle back, pressing his warm flank against her leg, checking on her. It was a silent conversation, a bond forged in the fires of survival. "I am here. We are together. Keep moving." Elara's mind drifted back to the day she found him. It had been a spring storm, wet and heavy. She had been patrolling the perimeter of the sanctuary when she heard a sound that didn't belong, a soft, rhythmic mewling near the riverbank. He had been half drowned, a scrap of wet fur caught in the root system of a willow tree. His mother was nowhere to be found, likely a victim of the poachers that plagued the northern border. Elara had warmed him inside her jacket, against her skin, feeling his tiny heart flutter like a trapped bird. She had bottle-fed him, slept on the floor beside him, and taught him how to howl. He was the wolf of the hearth, the one who chose the fire over the forest, yet the wildness never truly left him. It just changed shape into a fierce, protective loyalty. Now that tiny scrap of fur was a 50-pound muscular engine pulling her through a blizzard. Left, Ginger, ha! Elara shouted over the wind. The pup veered instantly to the left, avoiding a hidden ravine that Elara knew by memory but couldn't see. His instincts were sharper than any GPS. He could smell the solid ground beneath the ice. They were descending into the tree line now, where the wind was slightly less violent, broken by the dense canopy of spruce and fir, but the cold was settling in, a creeping numbness in Elara's toes and fingers. This was the danger zone, the temperature where the body stops fighting and simply wants to sleep. They reached the valley floor after what felt like hours. The snow here was deeper, softer, like quicksand. This was the territory of the ghost pack. They were a group of outcasts, wolves injured by traps, rejected by other packs, or too old to keep up with the prime hunters. Elara had been tracking them for months, leaving food drops at the edge of their range, trying to build trust, but she had never seen them up close. They were ghosts, shadows that vanished when looked at directly. But the famine brought on by this winter changed the rules. The deer had moved south or were buried too deep to hunt. The ghost pack was starving. Elara had seen the tracks 2 days ago, heavy, dragging paw prints that signaled exhaustion. If she didn't intervene tonight on this freezing Christmas Eve, there would be no tracks tomorrow. Ginger suddenly stopped. His hackles, the thick fur along his spine, stood straight up. He let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the leash. Elara froze. She unclipped the safety on the bear spray at her belt, though she knew it would be useless in this wind. "What is it, boy?" Ginger wasn't looking at the path ahead. He was looking into the black void between 2 ancient pines to their right. Elara squinted. At first, she saw nothing but the swirling snow. Then 2 pinpricks of gold appeared. Then 2 more. Then a dozen. Eyes watching them. The ghost pack had found them first. Fear, cold and sharp, spiked in Elara's chest. Starving wolves were unpredictable. Desperation overrode fear of humans. She was one woman with a sled of meat, and Ginger was just a pup compared to the scarred veterans of the wild. If they decided to take the food by force, this mission would end in blood. "Easy," Elara murmured, keeping her voice calm and low. She slowly sank to one knee in the snow, lowering her profile. This was the protocol. Do not challenge, do not tower over them. Show them you are not a threat. Ginger stood like a statue between Elara and the eyes. He didn't growl again. He simply stood tall, his red harness and blinking light, making him look like a surreal guardian spirit. He puffed his chest out, his tail held high but not aggressive, a posture of confidence, of a diplomat rather than a warrior. A shape detached itself from the shadows. It was a massive gray wolf, skeletal thin, its ribs showing clearly through its matted winter coat. One of its ears was torn in half. This was the alpha, the one Elara called Spectre. Spectre took a step forward, his head low, teeth bared in a silent snarl. He was testing them. He smelled the meat in the saddlebags, the rich scent of venison blood cutting through the sterile ice air. His hunger was a palpable force. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She slowly reached into the sled, her movements exaggerated and fluid. She pulled out a large chunk of meat, a pristine cut of deer haunch. "Merry Christmas," she whispered, her voice cracking. She tossed the meat. It landed with a heavy thud in the snow, halfway between them and the alpha. Spectre flinched, jumping back. He looked at the meat, then at Elara, then at Ginger. The wild wolf seemed confused by the pup. Ginger was clearly a wolf, but he smelled of wood smoke, human soap, and synthetic fabric. He was an alien to them. Ginger took a step forward. Elara held her breath. "Ginger, stay," she warned softly. But the pup ignored her. He trotted up to the meat. Spectre growled, a thunderous sound, snapping his jaws. Ginger didn't back down, but he didn't attack either. He simply nudged the meat with his nose, pushing it closer to the starving alpha. Then he dipped his head in a submissive bow, a play bow, his tail wagging slowly. It was a gesture of absurd innocence in the face of death. He was inviting the starving killer to play, or perhaps, he was saying, "It's okay. It's a gift." The tension stretched, thin and brittle as ice. Spectre stared at the ginger pup. Then slowly, the wild fire in his eyes dimmed. The exhaustion took over. He stepped forward, snatched the meat, and retreated a few paces to devour it in 3 tearing bites. The spell was broken. Elara quickly began emptying the sled, tossing cuts of meat, suet blocks, and piles of kibble onto the snow. One by one, the other shadows emerged. A limping female, a young wolf with a missing tail, an old, gray-muzzled elder. They were a ragged band of survivors broken by the world, now eating a feast in the middle of a blizzard. Ginger watched them, his tail still wagging. He wanted to join them, to run and sniff and greet, but he stayed by Elara's side, his duty as her guardian overriding his instinct to pack. "Good boy," Elara breathed, tears of relief freezing instantly on her cheeks. "You're a good boy, Santa." They watched for 10 minutes as the pack ate. It wasn't enough to save them for the whole winter, but it would get them through the storm. It would give them strength to hunt again when the weather broke. It was a gift of time. As the pack finished, Spectre looked up. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't approach. But he held Elara's gaze for a long moment, a look of recognition, of acknowledgement. Then he turned and melted back into the forest, his family following him. The journey back was harder. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only the cold. The wind had shifted, blowing directly into their faces now. Elara's legs burned with lactic acid, every step a conscious effort of will. She stumbled more often, falling to her knees, the snow embracing her, begging her to just rest for a moment. "Just a minute," she mumbled, her speech slurring. Hypothermia was knocking on the door. Ginger barked, sharp and demanding. He grabbed the sleeve of her parka and tugged, pulling her off balance, forcing her to stand up to keep from face-planting. Okay, I'm up," she groaned. They were halfway up the ridge when the disaster struck. A crack, loud as a cannon blast, echoed from above. Elara looked up just in time to see a massive shelf of snow accumulated on the overhanging cliff face. Detach. "Run!" she screamed, though there was nowhere to run. The white wave crashed down. It wasn't a massive avalanche, just a localized slide, but it was enough. It hit them with the force of a freight train. Elara was tumbled, spun, and buried. The world went black. Weight pressed in on her from all sides, crushing her chest, cementing her limbs. Silence. Absolute suffocating silence. Elara panicked, thrashing, but the snow was packed tight as concrete. She couldn't move her arms. She couldn't draw a full breath. The darkness was absolute. She tried to scream, but her mouth was filled with snow. This is it, she thought, a strange calm washing over her. This is how it ends. Then she heard it, muffled, distant, but frantic. Digging, scratch, 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 a high-pitched whine. "Ginger," she tried to say, but no sound came out. The scratching got louder, closer. She could hear his panting, the desperate grunts of effort. He was digging for her. He hadn't run. He hadn't saved himself. Light broke through. A paw, wet and cold, slapped her face. Then a wet nose was shoving into her cheek, sniffing, licking. Ginger was whining hysterically, clearing the snow from around her head. Elara gasped, sucking in freezing, wonderful air. She coughed, spitting out snow. Ginger was there, his face coated in ice, his eyes wide with terror and love. He didn't stop. He kept digging, freeing her shoulders, her arms. It took them an hour to dig her out completely. Elara was shaking so hard she couldn't stand. She had lost a glove in the slide. Her hand was white, waxy, frostbite. Ginger seemed to understand. He lay down on top of her, his thick double coat acting as a living blanket. He licked her frozen hand, his rough tongue stimulating the blood flow, his body heat seeping into her core. They lay there in the crater of the avalanche, a woman and a wolf, huddled together against the fury of the night. "We have to move," Elara chattered, her teeth clacking together. "We'll die here." But she couldn't stand. Her energy reserves were gone. Ginger stood up. He looked at her, then looked up the trail towards the sanctuary lights. barely visible through the storm. He barked. He turned his back to her and waited. He wanted her to hold on. "I'm too heavy, Gingy," she whispered on. He barked again, insistent. He crouched lower. Elara realized he wasn't trying to carry her. He was offering himself as a crutch. She grabbed the handle of his harness with her good hand. He braced his legs, digging his claws into the ice. "Okay," she gritted out. "Together." She pulled. He pulled. She rose to her feet, leaning almost her entire weight on the young wolf. He didn't buckle. He growled, a sound of pure determination, and began to tow her up the hill, step by step, inch by inch. The red light on his back blinked. Beep, 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 a heartbeat in the darkness. They made it to the cabin door just as the storm intensified into a whiteout that reduced visibility to zero. Elara collapsed onto the mudroom floor, fumbling with the latch. As the door clicked shut, sealing out the roar of the wind, the silence of the cabin felt like a cathedral. She lay on the floor, unable to move, staring at the ceiling. Ginger collapsed beside her, his breathing ragged, his paws bleeding from the ice crust. Elara reached out and buried her hand in his ruff. "You saved me," she whispered. "You saved me, little wolf." Ginger licked the tears from her face, his tail thumping weakly against the floorboards. That night they slept in front of the wood stove, a tangle of limbs and fur. They had delivered Christmas to the ghosts, and in return, the ghosts had let them live. But as Elara drifted into a feverish sleep, she didn't know that the night's events had been watched. High on the ridge, looking down at the cabin through the storm, with eyes that saw heat rather than light, a massive shadow watched. It wasn't a wolf, it was something older, something that had been awoken by the scent of kindness in a land of cruelty, and it was coming down. The next morning, Christmas Day, broke cold and clear. The sun shattered against the ice, turning the world into a blinding prism of diamonds. Elara woke with a throbbing headache and a hand that burned with the pins and needles of recovering frostbite. She sat up, groaning. Ginger was already up. He was standing by the window, his ears pricked, staring out at the tree line. "What is it, buddy?" Elara asked, pulling herself up. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and joined him. She looked out. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the ghost pack, all 7 of them. They weren't hiding in the shadows. They were sitting in a semicircle, facing the cabin. And in the center of the circle, resting on the snow, was something that hadn't been there the night before. It was a deer carcass, fresh, a kill. They had brought a gift back. Elara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "They're returning the favor." It was a miracle of nature, a bridge crossed between species. But as she watched, the alpha, Spectre, suddenly stood up and snarled, spinning around to face the forest behind him. The rest of the pack scattered, their tails tucked, dissolving into the trees in seconds. Elara frowned, pressing her face to the glass. What spooked them? Then she saw it. Emerging from the deep woods, crushing the snow with strides that were terrifyingly long, was a man. But he wasn't dressed for hiking. He wore tattered military fatigues, gray camouflage that blended perfectly with the winter bark. He carried a compound bow, black and wicked looking, and trailing behind him on heavy chains were 2 dogs, not wolves, immense muscular mastiffs with spiked collars, poachers. They weren't supposed to be this far north. This was sanctuary land. The man stopped at the deer carcass. He nudged it with his boot, then looked up at the cabin. He saw Elara in the window. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply stared, a cold, predatory assessment. Then he unclipped the chains from the mastiffs. The dogs didn't bark. They just surged forward, silent killers, heading straight for the cabin door. Elara scrambled back, her heart stopping. She had bear spray, a flare gun, and a hatchet, but she was injured, exhausted, and trapped. "Ginger, back!" she shouted, grabbing the pup by the scruff. But Ginger didn't go back. He moved to the door, his lips peeling back to reveal gleaming white fangs. The playful Santa pup was gone. The wolf was here. The first heavy thud hit the door. The wood splintered. "Christmas is over," Elara whispered, reaching for the flare gun on the mantelpiece. The sound of splintering wood was a scream in the silence of the cabin. The heavy oak door, which had withstood 60-mile-an-hour winds the night before, groaned under the assault of the living battering rams outside. Elara's hands shook violently as she cracked the breech of the flare gun, sliding a red phosphorus shell into the chamber. It was an ancient thing, heavy steel, meant for signaling rescue, not combat. But in the claustrophobic confines of the cabin, it was a dragon's breath waiting to be exhaled. "Ginger, back!" Elara screamed again, her voice raw. The pup didn't listen. The primitive brain, the ancient wolf DNA that had been slumbering beneath the layers of domesticity and belly rubs, had fully awakened. His hackles were a jagged ridge along his spine. He wasn't barking anymore. The time for warning was over. He was low to the ground, coiled like a copper spring, positioning himself perfectly between Elara and the buckling door. He knew with an instinct that predated language that the things on the other side were not like the ghost pack. They were slaves to a master, machines of meat and teeth bred for violence. Another thud. The latch exploded inward, sending shards of iron skittering across the floorboards. The door swung open, banging against the wall, bringing with it a gust of freezing wind and the smell of wet fur and musk. The first mastiff surged in. It was a monstrosity of muscle, black and tan, wearing a spiked leather collar that looked like a torture device. Its eyes were vacant, devoid of the intelligence Elara saw in wolves. It didn't pause to assess the room. It saw movement, Elara raising the gun, and launched itself. But it never reached her. Ginger hit the intruder in midair. It was a collision of physics that shouldn't have been possible. The mastiff outweighed him by 40 pounds, but Ginger had the velocity of a desperate protector. They crashed into the heavy wooden table, overturning it. The sound of snapping teeth was sickening, like dry branches breaking. Ginger was faster, a blur of red lightning, snapping at the mastiff's throat, avoiding the crushing jaws, using the furniture as terrain. "No!" Elara shrieked. The second mastiff filled the doorway, blocking the light. Behind it, the silhouette of the poacher stood calm, his bow drawn. He wasn't shooting yet. He was watching the dogfight with a detached professional curiosity. Elara leveled the flare gun at the doorway, not at the dog, but at the face of the man. "Call them off." The man didn't flinch. He just shifted his aim slightly. The compound bow's pulleys creaked. "That's a rare coat on that wolf," he said, his voice gravelly, unhurried. "Worth a lot more intact. Call him off and I might let you keep your fingers." The arrogance of it, the violation of her sanctuary, ignited a fury in Elara that burned hotter than the frostbite in her hand. She didn't bargain. She pulled the trigger. Thump, hiss. The flare didn't hit the man. In her trembling, she pulled wide. The magnesium slug struck the heavy timber of the door frame just inches from his head. It exploded into a blinding, searing white star. Sparks showered down like molten rain. The man shouted, throwing an arm up to shield his eyes. Stumbling back into the snow, the second mastiff, blinded and confused by the sudden supernova in the hallway, yelped and scrambled backward. Inside, the light was dazzling, casting chaotic, dancing shadows against the walls. The smell of burning sulfur and ozone choked the air. "Ginger, come!" Elara yelled, grabbing her hatchet from the woodpile. Ginger disengaged from the first mastiff. He was panting. Blood smeared on his muzzle, whether his or the dog's. Elara couldn't tell. The mastiff was shaking its head, blood dripping from a tear in its ear, disoriented by the flare's screaming hiss. Elara didn't wait. She grabbed the back of Ginger's harness and hauled him toward the rear of the cabin. The kitchen, the window above the sink. It was small, but it was their only exit. The front door was a kill zone. She scrambled onto the counter, kicking dirty dishes into the sink. The glass of the window was frozen shut. She smashed it with the butt of the hatchet, the sound of breaking glass lost in the roar of the dying flare in the other room. Cold air rushed in, sucking the smoke out. "Go! Jump!" She hoisted Ginger up. The pup scrambled, his claws screeching on the stainless steel, and vaulted through the broken frame, landing in a snowbank outside with a soft whump. Elara followed, tumbling out headfirst, landing hard on her shoulder. The pain was immediate and blinding, radiating down her frost-bitten arm. She bit her tongue to keep from screaming, tasting copper. They were out, but they weren't safe. They were in the deep snow behind the cabin, exposed. The woods were 50 yards away, a 50-yard dash through waist-deep powder. "Run!" she gasped, scrambling to her feet. They plunged into the drift. It was a nightmare of slow motion. The snow grabbed at her legs, heavy and wet. Every step was a deadlift. Behind them she heard the shouts of the man, the renewed barking of the dogs. They had recovered. Twang! Something hissed past Elara's ear, close enough to feel the wind of it. A black carbon fiber arrow buried itself in the trunk of a pine tree ahead of her, vibrating with lethal energy. He was hunting them, not trying to scare them, hunting them. "Zigzag!" Elara shouted to Ginger, though the wolf was already weaving, using the terrain, staying low. They hit the tree line just as another arrow thudded into the snow where Elara's foot had been a second before. The canopy of the forest swallowed them, offering a momentary reprieve from the sniper's line of sight. But the forest was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. The poacher had snowshoes. She could hear the distinct crunch-slide rhythm of them behind her. She was post-holing, sinking deep with every step, exhausting her energy reserves in seconds. She needed to think. She couldn't outrun him, not like this. She knew these woods better than anyone, but knowledge was useless without speed. Unless the ravine. Half a mile east, the land dropped away into a steep, rocky gorge carved by the Whitewater Creek. It was treacherous, filled with deadfall and unstable shale. No one in their right mind went down there in winter. It was a death trap, or a hiding spot. "This way," she wheezed, veering sharp right, forcing herself through a dense thicket of briars that tore at her parka and scratched her face. Ginger stuck to her leg, his body heat a constant reassurance. He kept looking back, growling low in his throat. They moved for 20 minutes, a grueling, lung-burning march. Elara's heart felt like it was going to burst. Her frostbitten hand was throbbing with a dull, sickening ache, and her feet were beginning to lose sensation again. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the cold reality of their situation. They reached the edge of the ravine. It was a jagged scar in the earth, the bottom lost in shadow and mist. The drop was 40 feet, not sheer, but steep enough to break bones. "We have to go down," Elara whispered, looking at Ginger. The pup looked over the edge, then back at her. He didn't hesitate. He trusted her. Suddenly the wind shifted. Ginger froze. He spun around, facing the way they had come. The fur on his neck stood up so stiff it looked like a ruff of copper wire. Silence. The birds had stopped singing. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the sound of heavy breathing. Not the man. The dogs. They were close. They weren't barking anymore. They were in stalking mode. Elara gripped the hatchet, her knuckles white. She looked around for a weapon, a rock, anything. Then she saw it. Above them, on the slope, a dead pine tree leaned precariously against a spruce, held up by a rotting branch and the tension of the ice. A widowmaker. The bushes parted. The two mastiffs emerged, looking like demons in the gray light. They were leashed now, held by the man who stepped out behind them. He looked untouched by the cold, his face hidden behind a thermal balaclava. He held the bow loosely, an arrow knocked. "Nowhere left to run, Mama Wolf," he called out. His voice was casual, terrifyingly conversational. "You're making this hard on yourself. Just give me the red one. I'll leave you here. You can probably walk out, maybe lose a few toes, but you'll live." Elara looked at Ginger. The pup was standing his ground, trembling with rage, not fear. He was ready to die for her. "Go to hell," Elara spat. The man sighed, as if disappointed by a child's tantrum. He raised the bow, Have it your way. Dogs first. I don't want to put a hole in the pelt if I don't have to. He unclipped the leashes. Get 'em. The mastiffs launched. Elara didn't wait for them to reach her. She turned and swung the hatchet with everything she had, not at the dogs, but at the trunk of the leaning dead pine. Crack! The frozen wood shattered. The tree groaned, gravity taking over. It twisted, sliding down the trunk of the spruce. Gathering speed, a massive wooden hammer swinging down from the sky. The man looked up, his eyes widening. He dove to the left. The dogs, focused entirely on the kill, didn't see it. The tree crashed into the snow with an earth-shaking boom right between Elara and the attackers. It created an explosion of powder, branches whipping like flails. One of the mastiffs yelped as a heavy limb clipped its hindquarters, sending it tumbling. The path was blocked by a wall of debris. "Jump!" Elara screamed, and she threw herself over the edge of the ravine. She slid, tumbling, bouncing off rocks and hidden roots. It was a chaotic, painful descent. She clawed at the snow, trying to slow her fall. Ginger was sliding next to her, surfing on his paws, agile as a mountain goat. They hit the bottom in a heap of snow and dead leaves. Elara groaned, clutching her ribs. Nothing felt broken, but everything hurt. She looked up. The wall of the ravine towered above them. High up, she could hear the dogs barking furiously at the blockage. "We bought maybe 10 minutes," she whispered, struggling to stand. "He'll find a way down." They limped along the frozen creek bed. The walls of the ravine offered cover from the wind, but it was a dead end. Eventually, the creek would hit the frozen waterfall, a sheer drop of ice. They were being funneled into a corner. As they walked, the atmosphere in the ravine began to change. The air grew heavier, stiller. Ginger stopped limping. He raised his head, sniffing the air, his ears swiveling. He wasn't smelling the dogs. He was smelling something else. He gave a low, questioning whine. Elara stopped. She felt it too, a presence. The sensation of being watched, not by one pair of eyes, but by many. From the rocks above, a pebble skittered down, then another. Elara looked up. Lining the rim of the ravine, looking down at them like gargoyles, were wolves. The ghost pack. Spectre was there, his torn ear silhouetted against the gray sky. Beside him was the limping female, the elder, all of them. They weren't looking at Elara, they were looking past her, back up the ravine towards the sounds of the pursuit. They had followed. They had heard the commotion, or perhaps in the mysterious way of the wild, they had sensed the distress of the ones who had fed them. "Help us," Elara whispered, her voice barely carrying. Spectre looked down at her. His yellow eyes were unreadable. He didn't howl, he didn't signal, he simply turned his head and vanished from the rim, the pack following him. They weren't coming down to help, they were moving to intercept. Hope, fragile and desperate, flared in Elara's chest. "They're hunting him," she said to Ginger, but the poacher was armed with high-tech weaponry and killer dogs. 7 starving wolves against that. It would be a slaughter. "We have to help them," Elara realized. "He'll kill them all." She couldn't run away, not while her pack, because they were her pack now, walked into a meat grinder. "Come on," she said, her voice hardening. She gripped the hatchet. Her fear had crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. They scrambled up a deer trail on the far side of the ravine, looping back toward the top. It was agonizing. Elara's lungs were burning with the cold air, her legs feeling like lead. But the sounds of the confrontation spurred her on, barking, the deep, booming bark of the mastiffs, the sharp, yipping snarls of wolves, and then the terrifying thwack of the bow. They crested the ridge. The scene below was chaos. The poacher had crossed the treefall. He was in a small clearing, his back to a rock face. The mastiffs were a swirling perimeter of violence, holding the ghost pack at bay. The wolves were darting in and out, using their speed, nipping at the dogs' heels, trying to separate them, but the mastiffs were armored and heavy. One of them had the limping female wolf by the scruff, shaking her violently. The poacher was calm. He drew, aimed, and fired. The arrow took the old wolf, the elder, in the shoulder. The wolf yelped and collapsed, thrashing in the snow. "No!" Elara screamed, charging from the tree line. She didn't have a plan. She just had rage. She ran toward the man, waving the hatchet, screaming to distract him. The poacher spun around. He saw her. He smiled beneath his mask. He had another arrow, knocked in a second. "Stupid!" he muttered. He raised the bow, aiming center mass at Elara. Ginger saw the threat. He didn't go for the man. He went for the bow. He launched himself at the man's arm. The poacher fired, but Ginger's impact threw his aim off. The arrow hissed past Elara's hip, slicing through her parka, grazing her skin like a hot wire. The man cursed, dropping the bow as 80 pounds of angry red wolf latched onto his forearm. The arm guard protected him from the teeth, but the force knocked him backward. He punched Ginger in the ribs with his free hand, a heavy blow that knocked the wind out of the pup. Ginger fell back, gasping. The man drew a knife, a long, serrated hunting knife. He stepped toward Ginger, who was struggling to rise. "You little pest," the man snarled. Elara was 10 feet away. She wouldn't make it in time. Spectre lunged from the side, but a mastiff intercepted him, slamming the alpha into the snow. The ghost pack was losing. They were too weak, too uncoordinated against this disciplined force. The man raised the knife, and then the forest went silent. It wasn't a gradual silence. It was an instant, terrified hush. The mastiffs stopped fighting, their ears flattening against their skulls. They whined, backing away, tails tucked so far between their legs they touched their stomachs. Even the poacher froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. A vibration traveled through the ground. Thump, 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 heavy, rhythmic, massive. From the dense shadows of the ancient spruce grove behind the poacher, a shape emerged. It was a wolf, but it was to a normal wolf what a tiger is to a house cat. It was immense, its shoulder height clearing the man's waist. Its fur was pure white, not the white of snow, but the white of old bone, scarred and thick. One eye was clouded over, white and blind. The other was a burning molten gold. The Winter King, the legend of the Deadwood Valley. He didn't growl, he didn't snarl. He simply breathed, a cloud of steam venting from his massive jaws like smoke from a dragon. He looked at the scene, the bleeding elder, the starving pack, the man with the knife standing over the ginger pup. The poacher lowered the knife, his eyes bulging. He had come for skins. He hadn't bargained for a monster. "Impossible," the man whispered. The great wolf looked at Ginger. He sniffed the air. He smelled the connection. He looked at Elara. Then he looked at the poacher, and for the first time he opened his mouth. The roar that came out wasn't a howl. It was a roar, a primal sound that shook the snow from the trees. It was the sound of the mountain itself declaring war. The mastiffs broke. Trained killers, fearless against bears, they turned and fled, yelping in terror, dragging their leashes, abandoning their master. The poacher was alone. He looked at his bow lying in the snow 5 feet away. He looked at the white monster. He made a choice. He lunged for the bow. The Winter King moved. He didn't run. He flowed, a white avalanche of muscle. He covered the distance in a single bound. But he didn't kill the man. He slammed into him, a shoulder check that sounded like a car crash. The poacher flew 10 feet, slamming into the rock face, crumpling to the ground. The wind driven from him, his knife spinning away into a drift. The great wolf stood over him, his massive jaws inches from the man's face. Drool dripped onto the poacher's balaclava. The man was paralyzed with terror, sobbing quietly. Elara stood frozen. She realized with a jolt that the great wolf wasn't killing him because he was waiting. He turned his massive head and looked at Spectre. He looked at the ghost pack. He was offering the kill to them. Justice. Spectre, bleeding and battered, limped forward. The rest of the pack followed. They circled the man, a ring of teeth and vengeance. "Elara," the man whimpered, looking at her. "Please, call them off, please." Elara looked at the elder wolf writhing in the snow with an arrow in its shoulder. She looked at Ginger, who was wheezing, clutching his bruised ribs. She looked at the man who had come to harvest their skins for money. She stepped forward. The great wolf watched her. "Ginger," she said softly. The ginger pup limped over to her side. leaning against her leg. Elara looked at the poacher. "I don't control them," she said, her voice devoid of sympathy, "and neither do you." But she couldn't watch a murder, not like this. "Spectre," she said, her voice commanding. The alpha looked at her. "Leave him," she said. "Let the mountain take him." It was a crueler fate. Without his dogs, without his bow, injured, miles from the road, in a blizzard that was picking up again. The chances of survival were slim. Spectre hesitated. He looked at the great wolf. The giant dipped his head once, a slow nod. Spectre snarled at the man, snapping his jaws inches from his nose, then backed away. The man scrambled up, clutching his ribs. He didn't look back. He ran, stumbling, terrified, disappearing into the white void of the forest, heading away from safety, driven by blind panic. Elara dropped to her knees beside the elder wolf. The arrow had gone through the muscle, missing the bone. It was bad, but treatable. If she could get him to the cabin. She looked up at the great wolf. He was watching her. He took a step forward, towering over her. Up close, he smelled of pine resin and ancient earth. He lowered his massive head and sniffed Ginger. Ginger, the brave Santa pup, didn't cower. He reached up and licked the giant's nose. The great wolf didn't recoil. He chuffed, a soft sound. Then he looked at Elara, his golden eye piercing her soul. He turned and walked into the trees, dissolving into the snow as if he had never been there. The ghost pack remained. They were battered, bleeding, and exhausted. "Okay," Elara whispered, tears freezing on her face. "Okay, let's go home." But as she tried to lift the injured elder, a new sound cut through the wind, a low rumble, not a growl, an engine. Elara froze. The poacher hadn't come alone. Through the trees, the headlights of a snowmobile cut through the gloom. Then another, then a third. The poacher's panic run hadn't been aimless. He had been running toward his backup. Men's voices shouted, "Over here! I see the tracks!" There were at least 4 of them, and they had rifles. Elara looked at the exhausted pack. They couldn't run. The elder couldn't move. They were sitting ducks. She looked at the cabin visible on the ridge above them. It was a fortress, but it was compromised. And getting the wolves up there in time. "We have to stand," Elara said, grabbing the poacher's discarded bow from the snow. She didn't know how to shoot it well, but she knew the basics. She nocked an arrow. "Ginger," she said, her voice shaking. "Guard." The pup stood in front of the injured elder, baring his teeth. The snowmobiles roared into the clearing, surrounding them. The artificial light was blinding, a harsh blue-white glare that erased the natural shadows of the forest and replaced them with the stark, sterile illumination of technology. The engines of the 4 snowmobiles idled with a throaty, synchronized rumble, a mechanical pack growling at the biological one. The exhaust fumes, thick and acrid, drifted across the clearing, choking the crisp scent of pine and snow. Elara stood her ground, the carbon fiber bow feeling alien and heavy in her frost-bitten grip. She had one arrow knocked, the razor tip wavering slightly as shivers of cold and terror racked her body. Behind her, the ghost pack huddled in a tight defensive knot around the fallen elder, with Ginger standing at the apex, a small defiant flame of russet fur against the encroaching wall of machines. The lead snowmobile, a massive black utility sled equipped with rifle racks and winch gear, cut its engine. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the ticking of cooling metal and the ragged breathing of the wolves. A man stepped off. He was huge, wrapped in high-end Arctic gear, his face obscured by a mirrored visor. He held a scoped rifle casually across his chest, the way a businessman holds a briefcase. He scanned the scene, the trembling woman, the battered wolves, the defiant pup, and flipped his visor up. His face was hard, wind-burned, with eyes that looked like chips of flint. "Well," the man said, his voice booming in the quiet. "Vance said there was a crazy woman with a hatchet. He didn't mention she was leading a circus." The other men dismounted, their boots crunching loudly on the hard-packed snow. They spread out, forming a semicircle, blocking the path to the ravine and the ridge. They were professionals. They moved with economy and precision, weapons raised but not yet pointed directly to kill. They were assessing the merchandise. "That's far enough," Elara cried out, trying to inject steel into her voice, though it came out brittle. "This is private sanctuary land. You are trespassing. Leave now and I won't report this." The leader laughed, a dry barking sound. "Report it to who, darling? The storms knocked out the towers. The roads are buried. Out here, the law is whoever has the biggest gun." He gestured with his chin toward the wolves. "And right now, you're hoarding about $10,000 worth of pelt. Plus," his eyes locked onto Ginger. "Vance was right. That red one is a genetic jackpot. A trophy collector in Dubai would pay a mortgage for that hide." A low, vibrating growl started in Ginger's chest. It wasn't the play growl he used when tugging on a rope toy. It was deep, resonant, and dangerous. He took a step forward, placing himself directly in the line of fire between the leader and Elara. "Don't look at him," Elara warned, pulling the bowstring back. Her shoulders screamed in protest, the muscles threatening to spasm. "You touch these wolves and I swear I will put this arrow through you." The leader sneered. "You're shaking so bad you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, lady. Put the toy down before you hurt yourself." He racked the bolt of his rifle. "Boys, take the gray ones. Try for headshots. Keep the coats clean. I'll handle the pup and the girl." "No!" Elara screamed. She released the string. She hadn't aimed for the man. She knew she would miss, or worse, just wound him and trigger a massacre. She aimed for the snowmobile, specifically the auxiliary fuel canister strapped to the rear tunnel. The arrow flew. It was a sloppy shot, pulled by her shivering, but fate guided it. The razor head punctured the red plastic jerry can. Fuel gushed out, dark and glistening against the white snow, soaking into the hot exhaust pipe. Whoosh. It didn't explode, but it ignited. A sudden, violent fireball erupted from the back of the lead sled. The leader spun around, shouting as the heat washed over him. The sudden flash of orange fire in the blue-lit clearing was chaotic. The wolves panic-scattered, breaking the circle. "Fire! Get the fire extinguisher!" one of the men yelled, dropping his weapon to scoop snow onto the machine. "Kill the wolves!" the leader roared, recovering his senses. "Shoot them now!" The crack of a rifle split the air. A spray of snow erupted inches from Spectre's paws. The wolves were running, darting in panicked zigzags, but they were exhausted and injured. They were easy targets. Elara fumbled for another arrow, her fingers numb and useless. She dropped it. She fell to her knees, scrabbling in the snow. "Run, Ginger, run!" But Ginger didn't run. He saw a man raising a rifle toward the limping female wolf. The pup launched himself. He didn't have the weight of a killer, but he had the element of surprise. He clamped his jaws onto the man's boot, shaking his head violently. The man shouted, kicking out, sending Ginger tumbling, but the shot went wide, burying itself in a tree trunk. The leader turned his rifle on Ginger. "Annoying little rat," he muttered, centering the crosshairs. Elara screamed, a sound of pure, helpless despair. She lunged forward, unarmed, intending to throw her body bow over the pup. She never made it, and the man never pulled the trigger, because the mountain fell on him. It happened in a blur of white motion so fast the human eye couldn't track it. A massive shape dropped from the rock ledge above the clearing, a drop of 20 feet that would have shattered the legs of a normal animal. But the Winter King landed like a phantom, silent and heavy. He hit the leader. There was no contest. The man was 200 pounds of muscle and gear. The great wolf was 180 pounds of primal force. The impact crumpled the man into the snow. The rifle went flying. The Winter King didn't maul him. He stood on him. He planted 2 massive paws on the man's chest, pinning him to the earth, and let out a roar that wasn't just sound. It was a physical wave of pressure. The other 3 men froze. The fire on the snowmobile flickered, casting the giant wolf's shadow long and distorted against the trees. His one golden eye burned with an intelligence that was terrifying. He looked at the armed men, baring teeth that looked like ivory daggers. Then, from the darkness of the woods, came the answer, A woo-oo! It wasn't one howl, it was dozens. Elara looked around, stunned. The woods were coming alive. Shadows were detaching themselves from the trees. More wolves. Not the ghost pack. These were bigger, healthier, the Winter King's true pack. They had been there, hidden, waiting for the command of their alpha. The clearing was suddenly full of eyes. Gold, green, amber, 20, maybe 30 wolves circled the snowmobiles. They didn't attack. They just stood there, a silent, growling wall of nature. The poachers dropped their guns. The arrogance, the greed, the bravado, it all evaporated in the face of the apex predator's judgment. "We're leaving," one of the men squeaked, his hands in the air. "We're leaving right now," the Winter King snarled, a wet, guttural sound. He stepped off the leader's chest. The man gasped, rolling over, clutching his bruised ribs, terrified to look the beast in the face. He crawled backward through the snow, scrambling toward the remaining functional snowmobiles. "Go," Elara whispered, finding her voice, "and tell everyone what lives in these woods. Tell them this is Death's backyard." The men didn't need telling. They scrambled onto their sleds, abandoning the burning one, abandoning their rifles in the snow. Engines roared to life, high-pitched and frantic. They spun the machines around, throwing up roosts of snow, and fled. They didn't look back. They rode like the devil himself was snapping at their heels, their taillights disappearing into the swirling white void of the storm. Silence returned to the Deadwood Valley. The fire on the sled crackled, dying down. The Winter King stood in the center of the clearing, watching the retreat. Then he turned. The new wolves, the reinforcements, melted back into the trees as quickly as they had appeared. They were soldiers dismissed by their general. Only the Winter King, the ghost pack, Elara, and Ginger remained. Elara sank into the snow, the adrenaline crash hitting her like a physical blow. She was shaking uncontrollably. Her hands were blocks of ice. She couldn't feel her feet. We did it," she stuttered. Ginger trotted over to her. He was limping slightly, his ribs surely bruised, but his tail was high. He licked the tears from her face, whining softly. The Winter King walked over to the injured elder wolf. He sniffed the arrow wound, then licked it once, a gesture of pack healing. Then he looked at Elara. He moved closer, his massive head lowering until it was level with hers. Up close, he was terrifyingly beautiful. Scars crisscrossed his muzzle, a map of 100 battles. He huffed, a warm blast of air against her frozen face. It smelled of life. Then he nudged Ginger with his nose, pushing the pup toward Elara. "Take care of him," the gesture seemed to say. "He is of both worlds." With a final lingering look, the great wolf turned and loped into the darkness, vanishing into the storm that was finally, mercifully, beginning to break. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, agonizing procession. Elara couldn't walk without help. She used the poacher's abandoned rifle as a crutch on one side and leaned heavily on Spectre on the other. The alpha wolf, who had once looked at her as a food source, now walked beside her, matching her pace, offering his shoulder for support. They made a strange parade. A battered woman, a bright red pup, and 7 wild wolves, moving together through the knee-deep snow. When they reached the cabin, the door was still broken, hanging off its hinges. The wind blew through the main room. It was freezing. "We can't stay in the main room," Elara murmured. "The mudroom. It has an inner door." They crowded into the mudroom. It was tight, smelling of wet boots and damp coats. But it was windproof. Elara collapsed onto the pile of rugs in the corner. She fumbled with the first aid kit, her fingers clumsy. She managed to give the elder wolf a shot of antibiotics and pain medication from her emergency vet supplies. She cleaned the wound. It wasn't deep. He would live. Then she tended to herself. Warm packs on her hands, dry socks. She wrapped herself in 3 down sleeping bags. But the real warmth didn't come from the bags. One by one, the wolves lay down around her. Spectre curled up at her feet. The injured elder rested his head on her ankle. The others filled the space, a living carpet of fur, and right in the center, curled against her chest, listening to her heartbeat, was Ginger. They generated a heat that defied the laws of thermodynamics. It was the heat of a pack. Elara looked around the dim room, lit only by the blinking red light on Ginger's harness, which she hadn't bothered to turn off. Beep, beep, beep. "Merry Christmas," she whispered into Ginger's fur. The pup let out a long, contented sigh and closed his eyes. Elara didn't sleep immediately. She watched the rise and fall of the wolves, breathing. She thought about the poachers, about the Winter King, about the strange, terrifying magic of the valley. She had set out to give a gift to the strays, a few pounds of meat to help them survive. But the gift had been returned 1,000-fold. They had given her life. They had given her a family. The storm outside howled itself out, the wind dying down to a whisper. The clouds parted, revealing a moon so bright it turned the snow to silver dust. Morning came with a brilliance that hurt the eyes. Sunlight streamed through the small mudroom window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Elara woke to the feeling of a rough tongue on her nose. Spectre was standing over her. He wasn't snarling, he was waiting. Elara sat up, groaning as her stiff muscles protested. The wolves were stretching, yawning, shaking off the sleep. The elder wolf stood up, testing his leg. He limped, but he could put weight on it. Elara opened the inner door, then the broken outer door. The air was crisp, clean, and biting. The pack trotted out into the snow. They rolled in the fresh powder, cleaning their coats. Ginger joined them, bouncing like a rubber ball, tackling the limping female, initiating a game of tag. For the first time, they didn't treat him like an outcast or a curiosity. They chased him back. They accepted him. He was no longer just the human's pet. He was the Santa wolf who had fought the giants. Elara stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, sipping a mug of hot broth she had managed to make on the camping stove. She watched them play. Spectre stopped and looked back at her. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent communication passing between them. "We are kin now, but we belong to the woods." He gave a sharp bark. The pack fell in line. They began to trot toward the tree line, back to the wild, back to the secrets of the Deadwood Valley. Ginger watched them go. He took a few steps after them, whining. He looked at the forest, then he looked back at Elara. The choice was his. He had earned his place in the wild. He could go. He could be free. Elara held her breath. She wouldn't stop him. She loved him too much to own him. Ginger looked at Spectre, who had paused at the edge of the trees. The alpha waited. Ginger looked at Elara, shivering in the doorway, her hand bandaged, her eyes full of love and fear. The red pup gave a sharp bark at the wolves. A goodbye. Then he spun around and galloped back to the cabin, bounding up the steps, crashing into Elara's legs, nearly knocking her over. He buried his face in her blanket, wagging his tail so hard his whole body shook. He chose the hearth. He chose the human who had saved him. Elara fell to her knees, burying her face in his neck, sobbing with relief. "I know, buddy, I know." From the tree line, Spectre dipped his head. Then he turned and vanished into the white, the ghost pack fading back into the legend they were. Elara sat on the porch of the battered cabin, the sun warming her face, her arm around her brave, foolish, wonderful wolf. The Christmas star had long set, but the light it left behind, the light of connection, of survival, of a bond that transcended species, would burn brighter than any fire. They had survived the White Death. They had faced the monsters, and they had found that in the coldest place on earth, the warmest thing was a beating heart beside you.